The Gnostics. Our story begins in the early centuries of Christianity when the church was still finding its footing in a world filled with competing beliefs. Among the first to feel the weight of the church's disapproval were the Gnostics, a diverse group of early Christian sects that flourished in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The Gnostics, whose name derives from the Greek word gnosis meaning knowledge, believed in the pursuit of spiritual enlightenment through direct personal experience of the divine. As such, they rejected the material world as a flawed creation, often attributing its existence to a lesser, imperfect deity rather than the supreme God. This worldview, needless to say, clashed sharply with the emerging orthodoxy of the church, which sought to standardize doctrine and consolidate authority. By the 4th century, the Gnostics were branded heretics, their texts destroyed and their followers marginalized. In fact, it wasn't until the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in 1945 that many of their writings resurfaced, offering a glimpse into a rich spiritual tradition that had been all but erased. As the church grew in power and influence, so too did its capacity to enforce conformity. In the 12th century, we encounter the Cathars, a medieval Christian sect that emerged in present-day southern France. The Cathars, also known as Albigensians, preached a dualistic worldview, believing in the eternal struggle between a good spiritual God and an evil material world. They rejected the authority of the Catholic Church, viewing it as a corrupt and irredeemably tied to the material realm. The Cathars lived extremely disciplined lives, emphasizing poverty, simplicity, and spiritual purity. So, as expected, their growing influence alarmed the church, which saw them as a threat to its authority. So, in 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade, a brutal military campaign aimed at eradicating Catharism. And to say the crusade was brutal would be an understatement, man, because over the course of 2 decades, entire towns were massacred and the Cathar movement was effectively crushed, all through which the church's message was clear: either fall in line or face the consequences. And that's not even the most fucked up part, ladies and gentlemen. The most infamous moment came at the siege of Béziers, where a papal legate— English is my second language, so if I f up some words, please bear with me, guys. Anyway, this papal legate was asked, "How will you guys tell Cathars apart from Catholics?" And their response was, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Yeah, that was quite fucked, man. Anyway, the Inquisition, established in the aftermath of this crusade, continued to hunt down and punish those suspected of Cathar sympathies, leaving a legacy of fear and devastation. Which brings us to the next victims, the Spanish Inquisition. So, starting in the late 15th century, the Spanish Inquisition was basically the church's way of saying, "Hey, we noticed you're not Catholic enough, so let's fix that with torture." The Inquisition, as most of you remember, targeted Jews, Muslims, and anyone who dared look at a cross sideways, man. And the church really did have a whole menu of effective interrogation techniques like the rack, the Iron Maiden, and the good old-fashioned burning at the stake. Their goal was simple: to root out heresy. However, the result was a whole lot of innocent people screaming, "I'm Catholic, I swear," while being stretched like a piece of pretzel, man. And the irony in all this is that the church claimed that this was its way of rooting out evil and spreading God's love, man. Hey, sick, man. And by the way, the Inquisition targeted not only heretics but also Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity under duress. These conversos and moriscos, as they were called back then, were often suspected of secretly still practicing the original faith, and the Inquisition usually employed torture and public executions as a way to root out this perceived heresy. The persecution of William Tyndale. Moving forward in time, we find William Tyndale. For those who haven't heard of this legend yet, William Tyndale is the OG Bible translator who just wanted to make the good book accessible to common folk. He is actually easily one of the major reasons that the Bible is available in so many languages today. Anyway, here is his story. So back in the 16th century, the Catholic Church was like, "You know what, guys, only we get to interpret the Bible, and we've decided to keep it in languages only aristocrats will understand. We don't want the peasants getting any funny ideas, do we now?" However, Tyndale, being the rebellious linguist he was, went ahead and translated the New Testament into English, which would soon prove to be a fatal mistake, man. The church, as expected, was not amused. They hunted him down like he was a loose man-eating lion, and in 1536, they captured him, strangled him to death, and then burned his body at the stake for good measure. I guess to the church, nothing screamed love thy neighbor like silencing someone who wanted people to read the Bible in their own languages. So, Tyndale's crime was basically caring too much. Number 5, the trial of Joan of Arc, the teenage girl who terrified the church. Joan of Arc was a teenage peasant girl who led French troops to victory during the Hundred Years' War, and she basically became the medieval equivalent of a superhero. She claimed to hear voices from saints telling her to save France, and honestly, I'm an unbeliever, but even I have to agree that she delivered. Unfortunately, unlike you and I, the church was not impressed. In 1431, they put her on trial for heresy, witchcraft, and listen to this, wearing men's clothes, man. Scandalous. Now, needless to say, the trial was less about justice and more about silencing a powerful woman who threatened the status quo. And the church's tactics were brutal, man. They interrogated her for months, trying to trip her up with theological questions designed to make her look like a heretic. And Joan, despite being illiterate and just 19 years old, held her on like a boss. But unfortunately, in the end, the church wasn't about to let her win. They convicted her and burned her at the stake because nothing says God's love like executing a teenage girl who just wanted to save and serve her country. Decades later, the church realized, guys, we might have overreacted and declared her innocent. Too little, too late though, I might say. And to this day, Joan of Arc remains a symbol of courage and a stark reminder of how the church has often been more interested in maintaining power than doing what's right. The Anabaptists. The Renaissance and Reformation eras also brought new challenges to the church, as well as new targets for persecution. One such group was the Anabaptists, a radical Protestant movement that emerged in the 16th century. The Anabaptists, whose name means rebaptizers, believed in adult baptism, arguing that only those who could consciously choose to follow Christ should be baptized. They also advocated for the separation of church and state, pacifism, and communal living. But unfortunately, these beliefs, which challenged both Catholic and Protestant authorities, made the Anabaptists a target of intense persecution, man. Thousands were executed, often by drowning, a grim parody of their baptismal practices. The Galileo affair. Galileo Galilei, man, this dude had one of the coolest names in history. Yeah, anyway. He was the father of modern astronomy, and at one point in his life had the audacity to suggest that the earth revolved around the sun. Genius, right? Well, the church thought otherwise. In the 17th century, they put Galileo on trial for heresy because his scientific discoveries contradicted the interpretation of the Bible. The church was basically like, the sun revolves around the earth because we said so, and if you disagree, we'll make your life a living hell. And they could, man. So Galileo was forced to recant his findings and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. The church's stance was simple: we are right, science is wrong, and if you disagree, just come outside, we promise we won't jump you, man. Anyway, it is a perfect example of how the church will usually prioritize dogma over truth, even when the truth is staring them in the face, or through a telescope in this case. The witch hunts. Should we talk about the witch hunts of the early modern period in today's video as well? I mean, their story does represent another dark chapter in the history of church-sanctioned persecutions. As a brief rundown for those who haven't seen the previous videos where I've basically covered the witch hunts, just know that between the 15th and 18th centuries, tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft and executed. The church played a central role in promoting the belief in witches as agents of the devil, and its inquisitors were often at the forefront of the trials. The accused were subjected to horrific tortures to extract confessions, and the trials themselves were often steeped in misogyny and superstition. And as we would come to learn, the witch hunts were not merely a religious phenomenon, but also a reflection of broader societal anxieties, particularly in times of crisis. And yet, the church's role in legitimizing and perpetuating these fears cannot be overlooked, man. Anyway, that's it for today. So, to conclude, you know what they say: history is not merely a record of the past, but a living, breathing narrative that continues to shape our present and the future. By remembering those who in the past suffered for their beliefs, we not only honor their memories, but also reaffirm our commitment to a world where diversity and dissent are not only tolerated, but celebrated. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.